Domestically, Margaret Thatcher achieved everything she set out to. Assess the validity of this view. The aims of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher are broadly encompassed by the political ideology to which her name has been appended. This famous ideology, Thatcherism, is used to describe both the pioneering style of governance and revolutionary political policies adopted by Margaret Thatcher. The precise facets that comprise this renowned ideology, however, remain fiercely contested in modern historiography. Historian Ewan Green goes as far as to suggest Thatcherism's fundamental proposals existed before 1979, instead stemming from conservative discontent towards the post-war settlement. Although there is a wealth of historiographical literature devoted to the subject, no concrete answer has been formulated. Therefore, within this project, I have chosen to focus on three domestic pieces of Thatcherite ideology, all of which derive from statements made by Thatcher herself. The project will then proceed to ascertain whether these objectives ever came to fruition. Firstly, the relationship between Thatcherism and individualism, epitomised by the Prime Minister's hyperbolic statement regarding society, will be examined. I have chosen the 1980 Housing Act as the primary source for this example, fundamentally due to Chapter 51, the Right to Buy scheme. Arguably, its very existence represents the embodiment of Thatcherite ideals regarding the state's role in society, that it should be kept to a minimum. This ideology, according to Simon Jenkins, continued after her downfall. It will be asserted that despite the increased state intervention during the early Thatcher years, this objective had indeed become reality by 1990. Secondly, in relation to economics, I have chosen to principally focus on privatisation, which again largely encompasses this infamous aspect of Thatcherite rhetoric, reduced state intervention. Traditionally, this practice undoubtedly represents a reduction in state intervention. The link between this policy and Thatcherite ideology is supported by Thatcher's notorious statements regarding rolling back the frontiers of the state, delivered in Bruges in 1988. Privatisation and Thatcherism have indeed remained intrinsically linked in modern discourse. Ultimately, this appears the area in which reality and ideology are most closely attuned, something which is supported by both primary and secondary material. A speaker's fact sheet, produced by the National and Local Governments Officers Association, has been selected as the primary document to reinforce this argument. However, the area in which rhetoric and reality appear to fiercely juxtapose each other is in regard to societal discord between the government and citizens. If we define ideology as a system of ideals, we need look no further than the speech delivered by Thatcher on the steps of 10 Downing Street in 1979. "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony," she stated. Upon examining both secondary and primary material in the form of a special edition of the Minor, produced in 1984, this objective appears totally unfulfilled. If anything, Thatcher's premiership represents a catalyst in the worsening of such relations. The years 1979 to 1990 are continuously deemed a turning point in modern British history, a notion that has largely inspired this project. Although Thatcher's objectives were undoubtedly revolutionary, it is more debatable whether the same can be said for her years in power. This, primarily, has led me to question whether ideological objectives correlated with reality, and if Thatcher's domestic objectives were fully achieved. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of Thatcherism relates to the relationship between the state and the people. The Prime Minister, in regard to the general public, stated they are casting their problems at society, before going on to say, there is no such thing as society. This ultimately reveals Thatcher's belief that the role of the state in people's lives should be reduced, hence eradicating what she deemed the dependency culture and replacing it with a culture of individualism. However, upon close examination, ideology and reality appear to juxtapose each other. For example, despite Thatcher being lucky enough to inherit large profits from North Sea oil, a significant amount was in fact spent on increasing public expenditure, something the aforementioned quote suggests directly contradicts Thatcher's aims. Labour Minister Edmund Dell wrote that politics in the 1970s had been like a game of musical chairs, in which both parties prayed they would be in office when the oil started to flow. In 1980, Thatcher won this particular game. Due to large-scale extraction of oil beginning at the same time as world oil prices reaching a record high, profits were astronomical. However, as previously mentioned, and noted by historian John Campbell, a significant proportion of these profits were spent on increasing public expenditure. Crucially, the sharp rise in unemployment during the 1980s, largely caused by Thatcher's policies, meant the social security budget rose sharply. Indeed, this has led the likes of historian Andrew Rawnsley to argue that Thatcher fostered the dependency culture to which she was supposed to be opposed. As can be seen from this graph, government spending in the public sector initially increased under her leadership. Moreover, this second graph illustrates the rise in unemployment during the Thatcher years, lending itself to Rawnsley's assertion. By 1986, there were 3.1 million unemployed, and crucially, by 1989, over 8 million people were on income support. This proves, at least to an extent, that people remain dependent on state aid, and the supposedly dependency-based culture was not eradicated. Hence, a case can be made that this Thatcherite principle was never realised. However, upon examining further evidence, it does indeed appear that Margaret Thatcher reduced the state's involvement in the public sphere, thus making inroads into creating a culture of individualism and entrepreneurship. This is evidenced by the first primary source examined in this videocast, the Housing Act of 1980, enacted by Thatcher's government. Shortly after the Conservatives took office in 1979, the General Consent on Sales was amended, allowing authorities to make sales at the discounted prices promised in the 1979 manifesto. This is embodied by this piece of legislation, the most important aspect of which being the introduction of right to buy. This came under Chapter 51, with the Act reading, "An Act to give security of tenure and the right to buy their homes to tenants of local authorities and other bodies." This line of legislation represented a significant departure from previous governmental policy. Michael Heseltine noted that no single piece of legislation has enabled the transfer of so much capital wealth from the state to the people. He argued that right to buy had two main objectives: to give people what they wanted, and to reverse the trend of ever-increasing dominance of the state over the life of the individual. This sentiment clearly aligns with Thatcher's statement regarding society, and Thatcherite ideology itself. Some 6 million people were affected by the Act, with about 1 in 3 actually purchasing their unit. One clause in the legislation meant council tenants had the ability to buy their house at a discounted price, ranging from 33 to 50%, depending on how long they had resided in the property, with the proviso that if they sold their house before a minimum period had expired, they would have to pay back a proportion of the discount. Moreover, upon examining the Act, it reveals that mortgages would require no down payments. In combination, these aspects of the Act greatly increased the appeal of the scheme, developing a new ideology towards home ownership. Arguably, it can be inferred that Thatcher placed ideology above economics by enabling this Act, showing her fervent desire to diminish state intervention and replace it with individualism. Since 1980, UK home ownership has increased exponentially, as can be seen from this graph. Despite the success of this piece of legislation being fiercely contested in contemporary discussion, the crucial aforementioned line of text, "An Act to give security of tenure and the right to buy their homes to tenants of local authorities and other bodies," undoubtedly represents a decrease in state intervention. Britain has transitioned towards Thatcher's goal of a property-owning democracy due almost solely to the details of this piece of legislation. Ideologically, home ownership has become the goal for most individuals, with a certain stigma now attached to social housing. This new culture of individualism is ultimately what Thatcher was advocating via her hyperbolic statement, "There's no such thing as society." Hence, to suggest Thatcherite ideology was never achieved appears an extreme and unrealistic line of argument. Arguably, the area that most historiography is focused upon is Thatcherism's economic aspects, in particular, privatisation. At its most crude, Thatcherism represents a reduction in state intervention. This is partially illustrated by Thatcher's infamous Bruges speech. From this speech, Thatcher's desire to roll back the frontiers of the state, ultimately meaning a reduction in state intervention, is unequivocally revealed. This leaves us with the task of deducing whether this particular aim was achieved economically, having already examined it in a social context. Primary source material arguably provides the best form of evidence when formulating an accurate conclusion. In 1985, the National and Local Government Officers Association, NALGO, produced a speaker's fact sheet in opposition to privatisation. The NLGO was a British trade union representing mostly local government, white-collar workers. By the late 1970s, it was the largest British trade union, with over 700,000 members. The nature of the source, a speaker's fact sheet, arguably suggests the NALGO planned for this argument to be spread throughout Britain by a variety of speakers in order to further discontent towards the government. The fact it was produced, therefore, implies that there was already feelings of hostility towards the government's agenda of privatisation, in turn suggesting that it was in fact a reality. This is indeed supported by secondary material. Notable privatisations in the UK prior to 1985 included Britoil in 1982, Amersham International plc in 1982, British Telecom in 1984, and Sea Link Ferries, also in 1984. The source mainly focuses on the harmful impacts of privatisation on the workers, which is unsurprising given the nature of its producer. It is argued that contractors make their profits by cutting jobs, pay, standards of service, and working conditions. Moreover, it's also noted how, as soon as services are handed over to private contractors, the public loses its say in how services are run. Ultimately, these speeches would have little resonance if existing fears weren't already present. Workers would be unlikely to respond positively to notions that were fabricated by the NALGO. Therefore, far examining this primary source and comparing it with secondary material, it is undoubtable that the Thatcherite programme of privatisation was very much a reality. Finally, perhaps one of the most notable speeches given by Margaret Thatcher was her quoting of Francis of Assisi as she stood on the steps of number 10 Downing Street. Of these objectives, arguably the most paradoxical was Thatcher's objective to bring harmony to a country ravaged by discord. Thatcher stated, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony." From this speech, we can infer that, socially, Thatcherism was concerned with quelling the problem of poor industrial relations. Undoubtedly, discord between the government and the British public was rife prior to Thatcher's premiership. This is perhaps best exemplified by the Winter of Discontent, which refers to the winter of 1978-79. During this period, there were widespread strikes by public sector trade unions who demanded larger pay rises. This was in direct retaliation to the ongoing pay caps imposed by the Labour government, which were designed to control inflation. The Winter of Discontent marked the pinnacle of a decade in British history where industrial relations were at a nadir. Hence, Britain appeared a deeply divided nation, with the plethora of strike action highlighting this acrimonious relationship between the British public and the elected government. However, to suggest that Thatcher healed these wounds and enjoyed a harmonious relationship with the British workers appears flagrantly erroneous. This is epitomised by Thatcher's notorious relationship with the British miners, bringing us to the final primary source of this videocast. This final source is a special issue of The Miner, a journal of the National Union of Mine Workers, published during the miners' strike on the 30th of June 1984. Hence, it was produced in an atmosphere of industrial unrest. Arguably, it was produced to increase the existing aggression towards the government and fuel miners' discontent. This is evidenced by a closer examination of the literature utilised. The repeated usage of "our," illustrated by the main headline, "Time is now on our side," creates a confrontational relationship between the miners and the government, creating an us and them paradigm. This perspective was arguably shared by Thatcher herself, as she later described the miners as the enemy within, hardly a sentiment that implied her desire to create harmony. Moreover, the headline, "My salute to the Notts heroes," appears to have almost military connotations. The Nottinghamshire miners are practically represented as war heroes, who've struck a withering blow to the offensive government by going on strike. This supports the earlier notion of us and them in regard to the miners' relationship with the government. Additionally, the images utilised within the article highlight the police brutality shown towards the seemingly pacifistic miners. Indeed, given the police were following governmental orders, the source strongly implies that the Thatcher government was pivotal in the creation of such a combative relationship. This photograph of a police officer swinging his baton at a miner, who can be seen to have his hand up in defence, suggests police brutality was indeed prevalent during the event, whilst implying the miners present at the Battle of Orgreave were relatively pacifistic. Secondary material reinforces this notion. John Campbell implying the event showed an uncontrollable police force allowed to commit atrocities due to governmental action. Hence, an adversarial relationship between the government and miners is depicted, suggesting that Thatcher failed to alleviate the discord she inherited in 1979. Overall, Margaret Thatcher arguably had the most ambitious aims of any Prime Minister. According to Bernard Donoghu, Keynesian economic theory, advocating high state intervention, had ruled the post-war period. It was to this practice that Thatcherite ideology was fiercely opposed. Thatcher sought to breed a culture of individualism, whereby the state's influence on the citizens' daily lives was significantly reduced. Socially, this was partially achieved, as is illustrated by the Right to Buy Act, which fostered a culture of individualism. This culture has flourished as home ownership has increased, with social housing now facing a distinct stigma. Economically, this same Thatcherite principle has been examined, revealing a further reduction in the cold hand of the state. Privatisation epitomises this triumph, fundamentally representing Thatcher's desire to roll back the frontiers of the state. However, her hyperbolic statement, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony," shows a distinct paradox between rhetoric and reality. Discord proliferated under Thatcher's Britain, with perhaps the most adversarial relationship between the British government and its people created. To conclude this project, Thatcher's domestic aims have been divided into economic and social. It appears fair to suggest that Thatcher's infamous economic ideology unequivocally matched reality, leaving a legacy that Simon Jenkins argues has prevailed to the modern day. However, socially, Thatcher's achievements in relation to her personal objectives are less discernible. Thatcher failed to alleviate the discord she was supposedly opposed to, and as the aforementioned Rawnsley suggests, Thatcher's negative effects on unemployment have left a dark legacy of dependency. Hence, although Thatcher did create a society more keenly focused on individualism, to suggest that dependency culture was totally vanquished appears flagrantly erroneous. Therefore, the failure to alleviate discord in Britain, combined with the continuation of a dependency culture, means that domestically, Thatcher's aims were only partially achieved. Economic objectives undoubtedly came to fruition, but in regard to society, rhetoric and reality are less closely attuned.